Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.dev, and this is going to be another video in our Intro to React 2024 series. And this one we're going to talk about probably I think one of the trickiest things to really appreciate in React, which is the useEffect hook, because the name doesn't really give you a clear idea of what it's trying to do. And then two, being able to fetch a data asynchronously in React, because it does require some sort of interesting patterns. Okay, so let's do that. Okay, so let's create a new component or new folder for today's lesson. So let's call this like fetch useEffect. Okay, and we'll just say fetch underscore useEffect. Okay, and then I'm going to create a new file here. We'll call this fetch lesson .js x. Create our component function fetch lesson, return a div, okay, that says fetch lesson, and then we export default the component. Okay, so now that the components are exported, I'm going to head back to my app.js, and then I'm going to replace this with that. So import fetch lesson, and then I'm going to want to delete this one, and this is going to become fetch lesson. Okay, cool. Awesome. Now, what we're going to be talking about today is fetching. So again, if you're not familiar with the fetch function in JavaScript to be able to make API calls, I recommend watching some of my videos about asynchronous JavaScript, about fetch, about those things. I'll mention a little bit about it, but the bottom line is this. If you want to make a request to data outside, from the API or something like that, you use fetch. You could also use like Axios or something like that. This is also going to apply with any kind of asynchronous actions you're taking from your React code. Okay, so let's do this. Okay, head back to my fetch lesson here. Okay, so first off, let's just show you how you'd make an API call, okay, in React. Okay, doing that is not going to be anything all that different than making an API call anywhere else. So for example, I'm going to pretend that I have this dummy data.netlify.app page. This is just a place I have with some dummy data to practice API calls with. So here we're going to have the Pokemon information. Okay, so all the data about all the Pokemon. Okay, now what I want to do is get that data. Okay, so I can say, hey, const. Well, the way I would do this is you would basically say const. Well, let's just do this. Fetch. Then we pass the URL. Then you would do .then, and this would give you the response. And then we would want to return res.json to basically convert that data, that JSON response into an actual JavaScript object. The next .then would receive the actual data, and then we would be able to console.log that data. Okay, and if I go back over here and I take a look at my console. Okay, you see there's the array of 151 Pokemon. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. The problem is I want to use that in my output. Okay, the problem is this has already rendered. Okay, this div has already rendered. So the only way for me to get that available to be displayed is I have to, well, the way I'm going to have to do this is I have to use state, right? Because I needed to update on an additional render. So I need to have state to put that Pokemon in. Okay, so I'll say, okay, so that means I'm going to need to import use state. Okay, the reason being is that I have to have that data stored somewhere that'll trigger an update. Okay, const. Okay, const, we'll say Pokemon, set Pokemon equals use state, and then we'll start off as an empty array. Actually, let me take a look at how this is usually set up. It is an object with well, we'll still make it work. Okay, with an empty array. Okay, awesome. Cool. Now, the problem is, if I were to actually just go here and do set Pokemon, what would that do? It would trigger an update, but then the update, this fetch would run again, and then update the state again. And then you'd create basically an infinite loop where basically it's just the component is just going to update itself infinitely. Okay, it's very much, making API calls in React can very much be a foot gun, in the sense that you can accidentally shoot yourself in the foot and create infinite loops, which can create a ridiculous amount of API calls to your APIs if you are not careful. Okay, so how do I avoid this? Well, this is where the useEffect hook comes into play. Okay, the useEffect hook allows us to do a few things. Okay, it would, and this is why the useEffect hook is really kind of confusing. Okay, essentially what you would do is you would just create a useEffect. So you would use a useEffect over here. Okay, and useEffect takes two arguments. It takes a function and an array, and it's always important that you have both arguments. Okay, never forget, if you forget this array, you will end up with infinite loops again. Okay, so make sure you don't forget that array. The reason being is that that array determines when this function should run. So the idea is that this function, when you have a useEffect, this useEffect will run the first time this component loads. So the very first time this component updates or renders, this function will run. But on future updates, this function will only run if something in the array has changed. Okay, so if there's nothing in the array, it'll never run again, which is what I want. I don't want to fetch the Pokemon more than once. So then what we do is we'll put our fetch logic into there. So the idea is that you would want to put your API call inside the useEffect. Okay, cool. So now what I can do is that here inside the second.then, where I have the data, that's where I can say, hey, you know what? Let me do something like this. Like say, let me think about it. Set Pokemon. And I don't want to set Pokemon to the exact data because the data is just an object. I can see here. This is why it's important to console log things. I can see that the data is not the array that I want. The array is a property of the object. There's a Pokemon property in there. So in that case, what I want is that data.Pokemon to be the value of that. Cool. Okay, and now if I go over here and I console.log Pokemon, I console.log the state. Actually, even better, let's not even bother console logging the state, because again, use DevTools. If I go back to my React DevTools now, and I go to fetch lesson, and I examine its state, I can see there's the state hook, and there's all the Pokemon. So wonderful. Okay, I've done the thing. Okay, now this can get, see, like this looks a little hard to read a bit, you know. This is where sometimes like wrapping up some of this stuff is kind of better done in sort of custom hooks. Okay, so how would you do that? So this is where you can actually create custom hooks to make your life a lot easier. Because again, seeing all this, especially when it comes to like making API calls, I love wrapping those in custom hooks because it just makes this look a lot less messy. So in this case, how would I do that? I would create a new file. We'll call it, like, let's say use Pokemon, because that's what it's going to do. It's going to get us Pokemon. And in here, I would import the same hooks that I used before. So I would import use state and use effect. Okay, and what you do is you just write a function. So in this case, function use Pokemon. And what I do is I just basically copy all that hooks logic into there. So I'll just literally just cut this right out. Cool. And then what I can do is at the end of all this, I would just return Pokemon. I could return set Pokemon if I need it, but I don't. Okay, I only want to, use set Pokemon on that initial API call. So this does the job. Okay. So essentially, I just want to return that variable, that state variable. But I also, again, I want to make sure that I make that API call to fetch it. And I want to make sure I set that up that it only happens once, which I do right there. Okay, so now I've extracted that logic in there, and I can now export default use Pokemon. And now I can go back over here Okay, and back to my fetch lesson, and basically import use Pokemon, my custom hook, and now I can say const Pokemon equals use Pokemon. And see, like that just looks a lot cleaner, okay? And especially if I'm someone who's just reading your code, I don't need to know exactly how all the implementation details, but it's very obvious to me that basically that Pokemon is going to return me the value of Pokemon. Okay, I can kind of get and then I can go find the file where you define that function to kind of see how that hook works. And then let me just console.log. Well, let's just leave it at that. So now if I go back over here and I take a look at React DevTools, I click on Fetch Lesson. I scroll down. Props rendered by... Oh no, I'm still looking at app. Show me Fetch Lesson. Okay, so you can see hooks. See, when you use a custom hook, it actually even shows you a custom name. So instead of saying like use state, it says Pokemon. And then I can actually see in there's where the Pokemon stay, and I can see there was a useEffect in there and all that good stuff. So this just makes making API calls a lot cleaner. Okay. But now again, this is a stateful component. So since this component has state, I'd rather not handle the UI logic in here. Okay. So in that case, I'm going to create two components. Okay. I'll create a new file called all Pokemon.jsx and new Pokemon or single Pokemon.jsx. Okay. Now, in this case, we want to do something like, first we'll create the all Pokemon. So function all Pokemon, and that's going to receive props because we have to send the Pokemon down as props. Okay. And in this case, what I want to actually do is render two things depending on whether I have the data or not. Okay. So I know that in my logic that the initial value of Pokemon is an empty array. Okay. So I know that the API call hasn't happened yet while the array is empty. So I can use something like this. I can say, hey, if props.Pokemon.length equals 0, that's the only situation this should be the case, return h1 loading. Okay, so it's loading Pokemon. Else, okay, then basically it should be something other than 0, so it should be more than 0, because again, it's basically either going to succeed or not succeed, or either we have the Pokemon or we don't have the Pokemon. In this case here, we then return, and what we would do is we would map over the Pokemon. Okay, so we would just say props.Pokemon.map, and then for each Pokemon, what I'd want to do is return, right now we'll just return an h1 that says Pokemon. Okay. And let me see why. Pokemon.map. Oh, because we already have a variable named Pokemon. So what I'll do is I'll just do P. Okay. Okay. And that's fine. That's never used for now. Okay. And that'll be this component. Okay, so essentially this component, what it renders depends on the props that come in. Okay, so I handle like the checking and all that stuff here. And then we export default this component, all Pokemon. Okay, and then let's go use it in our fetch Pokemon lesson. Import all Pokemon. So in this case, now what we'll do is we're going to return all Pokemon, passing Pokemon as the prop. Okay, and see now we're rendering 1h1 for each Pokemon. So we know that this is fetching the Pokemon that we have in our custom hook. We are then passing it to a component whose job is just to make sure that it iterates through the Pokemon. And now we're going to create a component that actually displays the Pokemon. Okay, cool. And then taking a look at here, so I can understand, hey, what does a Pokemon object look like? So I can open one up. Okay, each one has an ID. So I can take advantage of that. So I can say, hey, well, first let's just create the component. Single Pokemon function function single Pokemon. We're going to use props. Okay, and that prop is just going to be a Pokemon. Okay, and okay, or we'll just say Poke, so make it shorter, less typing. Okay, and then what we're going to do is return a div where we have an h2 with the poke dot. Does it have a name? Yep, name. There's a name property. How do I know? I'm looking in my state, so I can see the results of the API call in my state, so I can examine what an object looks like. So I can see it also has an image property. So I can say, hey, image source equals poke dot image. Okay, and we'll leave it at that. Okay. So then we export default Pokemon, or single Pokemon. Okay, so there is our component, our single Pokemon component, which I can then bring into all Pokemon. Import single Pokemon. And then now going forward, instead of rendering just an H1, we'll render a single Pokemon component. And each single Pokemon component will receive a key. That is going to be the Pokemon's ID. P.ID. And a Poke prop, which is going to equal the Pokemon itself. Okay, and there we go. There's all the Pokemon. Okay, but you can see that each component becomes a little bit easier to read because instead of breaking it up all into one big component, okay, I can see, okay, here, this custom hook handles the actual API call logic, okay, with all the useEffect and useState stuff. So that way I can just use that hook to grab that data, making that a lot cleaner. Then I just pass that to a component that handles the array, so it handles all the Pokemon. And what that component does just handles the looping over the Pokemon and just passing the data over to the single Pokemon component, which just handles how to display a single Pokemon. And the beauty of that is just that way, like, I'm not having to think about all these different things that are happening in one component because the different parts are in different components, and I can just focus on what that component is doing. So I don't have to think about, like, hey, how are all the Pokemon being looped over? How's the API call happening? I can just think about, okay, if I know what a Pokemon object looks like, how do I want it displayed on the screen? Okay, when I'm working on this component. So again, just sort of that thoughtful breaking down of what are the steps and how can you separate them out will just make your React code much more thoughtful. Okay, so that's kind of like how I would handle making API calls. But let's talk a little bit more about this useEffect component, or this useEffect hook. So let's do something. Let's see here. Probably the best way to do this is with like a counter. So let's see here. Create a new file, which is going to be just a whole new counter.jsx. I just want to show you a little bit more about the useEffect hook. So import useEffect and useState. Okay, so we're going to create another counter component. Okay, no props. This is just going to be a stateful and display component all wrapped up into one. So we're going to have a state, use state. Okay, and use state is const count set count, because again, we're just going to update the count equals use state 0. So very standard pattern there. And we're going to have an add one function. So const add one, where we just add 1 to the set count. We're just going to add 1 to the old state. So again, we'll say count, C for count, and it returns the count plus 1. Okay. So that's just going to add 1 to the count every time that function runs. Okay. And now we're going to have a well, first, before we do the use effect, let's just actually do the count. So let's see here. Return a div, and we'll have an h1 that shows the count. And then we will have a button that when you click on it, it runs the add1 function. And the button says click. And then we will export default this component. Okay, and this version of counter we'll be using in our, oh, I put it in the to-do list by accident. Okay, so let me move that over to the fetch useEffect lesson. Oops, there we go. Okay, fetch lesson, let me go import that counter component. Import counter. Let me wrap this in a fragment so that way we can have multiple things at the top level. Okay, and then let me put the counter here. Okay, so if we scroll to the top, we'll see the counter. There it is, and it's working. Wonderful. Okay. So now let's show you how this useEffect can work. Okay, so let's do this. So useEffect, again, takes two arguments, the function that you want to run, and then the array of dependencies. So in this case, you know, this could do something simple like just console.log count. That's all I wanted to do, console.log count. Now, what I will do is I want to add some dependencies because I only wanted the console log count when it's even. Okay, so I'll create a variable called const is even, and we'll just say, hey, count modulo 2, okay, equals 0. Because again, if that's true, then it is even. So I'm going to put that in my dependencies array. So that means whenever that changes, it's going to run this function again. Okay, so basically anytime it changes between true and false, let me think about that, because then it'll even when it goes from even to odd, it will console.log something else. And technically every other value would be divisible. So let's try this. We'll actually say is divisible by 5. By 5, and then changes to count divisible by 5. Okay, and then changes to is div by 5. Okay, and so basically anytime that changes, then what we'll do is we'll put an if statement here, and we'll say is div by 5. If it's true, then we'll console.log divisible by 5. So anytime you switch between true, anytime this becomes true or false, like anytime it switches, it's going to run this function again, but at least it's not running the function on every render. Because I could just do that if statement on every render, but then it's doing that calculation every time. In this case, which is a very minute optimization in this case. This would be more useful for like really heavy computations. But the idea is I'm only going to run this if statement whenever that true and false changes. Okay. And this warning here, see how it says React Hook useEffect has a missing dependency? That's just a warning. You can ignore that. It just assumes that you would want anything that you use in the useEffect as a dependency. That is not necessarily always the case. Okay, so in this case, I go console. Let's pay attention. Let's see here. So right now, let me refresh. Okay, so we see that the 0, and I guess 0 is divisible by 5 because technically it would modulo 0, so it doesn't really count, but let's see here. Okay, 1, but see, only count is not counting again because it's still false. Again, it's like divisible by 5 is false, divisible by 5 is false, divisible by 5 is false. So in that case, you know, the dependency hasn't changed, so it doesn't run the function again. Now, when I click to 5, 5 is divisible by 5, so it's going to change from false to true. So in that case, the dependency, this variable here, has changed on that particular run. So then we should see like a change. And there we go, divisible by 5. There it goes. And now if I click on it again, I see another console log because it changed again, but the if statement didn't run because it's false. And then it's going to be false, 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 and then divide by 5 again. So you'll notice that like you only see the console logs of the numbers on the numbers when you become divisible by 5 and after you leave that, because that's when the true and false is changing. Okay, because again, the idea is that this array determines, hey, only run this function if this thing changes in a particular update. Okay, so that's essentially how useEffect works. Again, it's not the most intuitive of the hooks, okay, which is why there's a lot of like abstractions that kind of help avoid using it, or a lot of efforts to try to avoid using it. One of the things I love about SolidJS, which is another framework, where it gives you this nice React feel without the need to think through this whole useEffect logic. But it can be useful, if once you get the hang of it. Now, the last aspect of useEffect. So again, so there's 3 scenarios you want to think of. Okay, if I want something to only happen once, like when the component loads, then you would just do useEffect. You would pass it a function. The function would just do whatever, and you would pass it an empty array. And the empty array would just never result in that function ever running again. Okay, which is typically what I use 90% of the time, because it's usually like API calls. And again, I just want to make the API call, and I never want to do it again. Okay. Now, if you want to run the function on certain updates, then you would do this. Okay, where basically you put something in the dependency array, and long as that thing, if the value of that changes, now be careful, don't put an array or an object in here, because again, an array and object is going to be unique every time, so it's just going to run every time. So you generally want to put like a number, a boolean, a string, something that can be comparable between updates. Okay, and then if that changes, then the function runs again. The last thing you can do with useEffect is if you want to run a function when the component is removed. Okay, this is a very rare case you would need this. Really, the situation you would need this is if you need to do cleanup work, which usually comes in the form of where you've been kind of going away from the React way of doing things, and you've added like event listeners to the window object. So you said, okay, hey, when you click anywhere on the screen, this happens. So you have to add like an event listener to the window object, but React is unaware of this. So in that case, if this component leaves the screen and you don't want that event listener there anymore, it's up to you to clean it up. So basically, React had to give you a way to access that point in time when the component leaves, so you can do that. That's what this next thing is. So essentially, in order for you to do something when the component is removed, you write the function, but then that function should return another function. Okay, so it would look like this, and essentially you would do your cleanup logic in here. So it was here console.log component removed. And actually, that should be a string. Okay, so let's manufacture a way for this component to be removed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a button. So I'm going to need state for this. Thinking what's the best way to do this? Yeah, we'll just say const. So I'm going to need the import useState. Import useState. Okay. Remove. We'll call this removed. Set removed. And it's just going to equal useState, which is going to be false. So the idea here is, if removed is true, we're going to return a different version of this where it's just the Pokemon. Okay, so we're going to remove the counter component in that version. But if it's not true, then we'll return this, and then we're going to add a button so you can change that. So say button on click. And then if you click on that button, the function that runs, literally all it's going to do is set removed to false. Okay. So when I hit save, okay, so again, so what happens if I click that button, which should be all the way at the bottom of the screen, So there's a button because I didn't actually put any text in the button. So we'll say, hey, remove counter. So we're going to want to go to the console so you can see that the thing say that. So refresh. Okay, so you see, like, it has been like removed and added a few times just because of some of the re-rendering. So that's why you're seeing like components removed. But now if I click all the way here at the bottom, remove counter, well, the counter should be removed, but it didn't. So let me think about why. Set removed, use state. Oh, I set it to false. I need to set it to true. Oops. Okay, so let me scroll all the way down. And you see you got that components removed console log because the counter component got removed from the screen, as you can see. So that is the third way you can use the useEffect. Okay, so again, it just depends what you want. Do you want to run something just once when the component loads? Do you want something to happen sometimes, but not every time? And do you want something to happen when the component is removed? That's what useEffect allows you to do. It allows you to kind of hook into these, what's referred to as the life cycle of the component in this really weird way, in this not necessarily very intuitive way, but that's what it does. So hopefully this gave you some information that's helpful. I'll see you later. Have a great day and enjoy.